I am Cinzia Albanesi. I am the president of the European Association of Community Psychology, and I'm very happy to introduce the webinar of today, and I will provide some information about the content. As you already know, we are going to have this conversation on refugees in Europe, and Serdar Değirmencioğlu will explain how community psychologists are responding. And I'm very happy to have the opportunity to introduce Serdar Değirmencioğlu for this conference, for this webinar, as we call them now, because he is a well-known professor of community psychology and of developmental psychology. And I think that he represents really a very important tradition in our discipline, that is the critical and social justice-oriented tradition. And his publication on children's rights, on militarism, on migration, and on personal debt, and many other issues are really strong proof of that. He has outspoken for children's rights, also in daily newspapers, and is really concerned on many issues. As you probably know, but I think it's worth to know, he's one of the founder, and he was the president of the European Association of Community Psychology. And actually, very recently, he has been elected as member at large of SCRA recently this year. And he has been very active in SCRA, as he chaired the International Committee twice, and also contributed with his work to different interest groups to SCRA, and also to the SCRA mentoring program, also, let's say, showing his attention to younger generation. He's member of the Executive Committee of the Society for the Study of Peace, Conflict and Violence, and Psychology, and a member of the Steering Committee of Psychologists for Social Responsibility. And I think it is also important to know that he has been working in the Turkish academia for 20 years, but then he was forced to move and go in exile in 2016 for his, I would say, position in support of peace. And since that, but even earlier, he has been visiting scholars. He had the visiting scholars position in many countries, including Italy, Belgium, Germany, and is going to be in Germany at Philip Schwarz Fellow as a Philip Schwarz Fellow at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. And he recently proposed to the European Association of Community Psychology an initiative to collect portraits of European community psychologists. And as a CPA, we were very happy with this idea, and we will host the portraits gallery in our websites from January 2021. I think that it's also important to give a very short introduction, as ideally today's webinar continues the dialogue between European and worldwide, hopefully, community psychologists on key contemporary challenges. And we are very engaged at the moment with the pandemic, which is now in its second outbreak, at least in Europe. And of course, the pandemic is one of those challenges. And also migrants are affected by the impact of COVID-19 and are part of the response to the pandemic. And this is particularly true for those in lower paid jobs, including women, who are overrepresented in care, service, and domestic work sectors, and are exposed to higher risk of contracting the virus but also they can make an important contribution to address the pandemic. Starting with the webinar of Donata, we already pointed out that the pandemic, as well as environmental issues, have profound widespread impact on migrant, refugees, and displaced persons, as well as on migrant patterns at the local and at the global level. And unfortunately, also the pandemic is not helping because it's boosting hate, discrimination, and xenophobia. And today I was listening to the news on TV, and I came across an interview, and the journalist was asking to a US white workman if he was worried about the pandemic and if this was an issue relevant for the election that are going to be very soon in the US. And this man replied that the most important problem in this country was not the pandemic, but the most important problem was hate. And bearing this sentence in mind, I think it's time to give the floor to Serdar for his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Cinzia, for the introduction, and particularly for the later section where you were describing the current state of affairs in Europe and elsewhere. Personally, I am having a difficult time focusing, particularly watching things happen and millions of people in very dire circumstances. So bear me with this presentation. I tried to make it an easier presentation to follow, omitting some difficulties, but rather difficult issues. But I hope some of these issues will come up during the discussion. And I hope I will be taking about 20-21 minutes so that there will be time for some discussion. So let me share my screen with the slideshow. And what I would like to do, first of all, of course, time myself, and also start with definitions. And when I say definitions, I'm not going to go into a lot of the definitions and the distinctions. I will be using migrant and refugees almost interchangeably, mainly because the distinction is trivial when it comes to serving people. But the migrant definition or a migrant is defined as a person who chooses to leave his or her home for any variety of reasons, but not necessarily because of a direct threat or persecution or death. The migrant is an umbrella category that can include refugees, but can also include people moving to improve their lives by finding work and education. The term to use is perhaps easier in this webinar, but in other places this can be a very heated discussion. It is often the case that the government, for instance, officials would prefer to use the term migrant and try avoiding using the term refugee because it carries the meaning of official recognition, etc. But for the sake of this webinar, I will be using the two of them almost interchangeably. Now, we need to consider the scale of what has happened in the last 5 years in particular. And I would like to start with this map just to help us gain an understanding of how people from Syria and other places can move through Turkey and reach Europe. If they are doing this, they will probably go to Greece, particularly if they are using the sea route. And when you look at the scale, of course, was astounding, particularly at the beginning. In 2015, it was almost 1 million people crossing the sea by boat. The sea was basically littered with black dots, and the dots were actually plastic moving objects full of people. Most of the people back then were from Syria, and if we want to specifically take a look at one single month, for instance, in 2016, you can find 40 or 50,000 people making that journey in a single month. So that was definitely astounding, very difficult, but in fact, a happier part because the people who made the journey were successful. The people who were not able to complete the journey often died in the sea, and they often made headlines only if they were either very young or they died in large numbers.
Serdar,
Yes.
sorry, just a question. Sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
At the moment, I think I can't see the slides as you are speaking, so I can just see the first one. So can you please check if, okay, now
Okay.
yes.
It might be because of my slideshow. I'm using something called Open Office. That might be the reason. So let me use this instead of the entire screen. Is this good enough?
Yeah.
If it is, okay, let's try this.
Yeah.
So in September 2015, I was in Northeast Lesbos in Skalas Kamya, where every single day boats were arriving. But to give you a sense of the density, I can describe one evening when 22 boats arrived in a single hour. If we want to make a quick calculation, each boat had about 40 to 60 people. They were supposed to contain up to 20 people, but they were always cramped. And if we do this, roughly 50 people per boat, that means in one single hour, 1,000 people arrived in Northeast Lesbos. And also, on average, each person paid 1,000 US dollars to make the journey. So this was a sum of $1 million in 1 hour. This sort of number is rarely discussed, but it has to be considered. There is a monetary side to human trafficking of this sort. Now, let's quickly move to the response from psychologists since 2015. First, let's consider mainstream psychology, and let's consider the European Federation of Psychological Associations. EFPA released a statement on the 22nd of September, and the statement basically urged all European governments, agencies, communities, and other responsible parts to involve the European psychologists in the efforts to deal with the refugee crisis. This was the term that was chosen. And then it said, EFPA is urging all psychologists in Europe to make their competence available to those trying to help the situation, both nationally and internationally. So the president of EFPA said, we share the responsibility to use our competence in trauma, grief, the consequences of loss of community, and difficulty in adaptation to new life conditions, and so on. There was action promised, and community psychology was also mentioned because the Standing Committee of Community Psychology was involved in the development of the statement. The statement promised action, and it was a little difficult to follow whether the action was followed through. But the action to thousands of psychologists and all sorts of organizations wasn't necessarily listened to. But one of the issues here to consider is that the choice of word, crisis, or the choice of term of crisis is rather misleading, particularly when the issue comes to mass migration. So I'll share with you this quote, which basically says, yes, this is an astounding moment. These are big numbers. This is mass migration. But the term crisis itself does not explain the situation. So what basically was the situation and what basically is the situation? I don't like the term new normal that is being used since the beginning of the pandemic, but perhaps we should use it here just to give you a sense of what the new normality is. Mass migration has become a rather routine phenomena. It is essential, therefore, for psychologists across Europe to move away from seeing migration as a temporary crisis, something that has to be dealt with temporarily, but rather focus on migration as a continuing reality that would happen in different ways from different places. It might be coming from the direction of North Africa, it might be coming from the direction of Near East, but it will be continuing. And if that is done, then psychologists can develop the skills, the knowledge, as well as the policies necessary to address mass migration. If we use the FPA language, that would mean the competence to address migration. Now, the question of competence is the next issue that needs to be dealt with. The dominant service model in mainstream psychology focuses on pre-existing expertise and competences. In other words, you give people the competences and then they go and serve. But if the competence is lacking, in other words, if something happens and people say, oh, we don't have the skills, we don't have the competence, then you basically can say, or you're entitled to say, we are unable to offer services. Now, that is a little difficult to accept when you think about mass migration. If mass migration happens, then perhaps psychologists are supposed to offer services. And it's not just psychologists with diplomas. Perhaps psychology students can also be involved, but they are often seen as incapable of handling a situation that involves mass migration. And so these are basically biases in the way service economies are built and the service economies work, but they need to be questioned. Now, of course, there are many psychologists dealing with refugees, and I'll give you a quote from Doctors Without Borders, Grigoris Kavarnos, clinical psychologist. He is faced with traumatic events, and this is a typical description that you would get from a clinical psychologist faced with refugees in a place like Lesbos with thousands of refugees in a camp like Moria. Then psychologists are asked to carry out vulnerability assessment to identify people who are most in need of services. That's also important. But when we are talking about thousands and thousands of people migrating from one place to Europe, these are not only the things that psychologists are going to do. Psychologists are also going to deal with other things, such as adjustment to the new settings, including adjustment to their new land, new city, new environment. And it is often the case that NGOs are asked to do this with support from EU, basically, funding, and sometimes state funding. NGOs offer psychological services in order to help the refugees adjust to their new and often difficult situations, and they also work on destigmatizing psychological services, particularly among the refugees, so that they could seek. But then you have migration policy coming in. The current European migration policy is built on deterrence. Deterrence meaning that people should stay wherever they are and they should not come to Europe and to the countries that are in the European Union. So what happens is when people arrive in places such as Lesbos, they are put in big camps where they are not treated as human beings or in a humane way. So this is a person from MSF describing the situation. Thousands of people being cramped in a camp, being treated in very difficult ways. So you might ask, what's the logic of this happening? Why are they treated this way? This is part of the deterrence policy. If you make life difficult for refugees, if they receive services, but they receive it only in emergencies, only under very difficult circumstances, deterrence would work. So the notion of making camps difficult is actually part of the policy. But then you have other people, such as Efi Lachudi, who think that these camps are not fit for people. People who are refugees should live in places that look more like a village rather than a huge camp. So they created, Efi and others, created a village named Pikpa in Lesvos that basically ran in accordance with community psychology principles or approaches, and it was clear that people benefited a lot. They targeted particularly the most vulnerable, but it was a village that was welcoming people. And Efi, by the way, received an award from UNHCR in 2016 for the work that she was doing for such a long time. Last year, I did a quick survey of people, community psychologists, working with refugees, and received very interesting messages. This is an example from Milano, or Milan in English. It basically says, this is a group working with refugees and asylum seekers, in other words, migrants, doing action research on the socio-spatial dimensions of centers built for these people. So the notion is that you need to ask these people so that you can build places that are fit for them, but also places that they can actually like and they can actually feel a belonging to and then own. Others worked to provide education. And this was particularly critical because of considering that many of the people arriving in Europe are young people. Therefore, the moment they are in a place such as Spain, they would need to acquire the language, the dominant language or the languages, and they also need skills so that they can survive. But a critical issue with this program was that psychology students were involved. And once psychology students were involved, they reported a sense of fulfillment, a sense of being with the refugees and benefiting from this. So an important component of involving psychology students in this sort of work is benefiting the refugees, but at the same time benefiting the psychology students as well. So therefore, I would argue that community psychology approaches, such as the Pikpa village approach, or such as the approach in Milano, where you build shelters involving people who are refugees so that they feel better fit of the shelter to their lives. These are community psychology approaches, and they appear to be uniquely well situated to respond to the inflow of refugees. But then, last year, people mentioned barriers. So some of the barriers have to do with who the refugees are. If you are a refugee or if you are a migrant, you are not a citizen. So you are not a citizen coming to a public facility. You are not a client who might pay for psychological services from his or her own pocket. And you are not an employee of a private business where the employer would rather pay for the services. So the issue here is that refugees in many places are not considered citizens, and therefore they are not entitled to services. You might think that this isn't happening because in some countries this doesn't happen, but in others, such as Greece, this does happen. The current government in Greece, for instance, in the very first week that they were elected, decided to take away social security numbers from refugees in Greece. And once they did that, the refugees were not entitled to health services. They could not send their children to schools. So they were basically frozen in time, despite the fact that they were living. And of course, this is why NGOs are important. NGOs are allowed to offer services when they are funded by the government or by the European Union. However, there is an issue of speed. In other words, slowness. Mainstream psychology in Europe tends to be slow. And the European Union itself is also not good at responding quickly. So going back to 2015, if we look at the refugees arriving in Lesbos, thousands of them, as we talked about, almost 1 million people arriving, there wasn't a single EU organization or unit assisting the refugees. There were perhaps 3 or 4 psychologists in Lesbos at that time, counting myself. So the lesson would be simple. If community psychologists follow the public service model, they may not be able to respond quickly. Another approach is needed so that psychologists, and particularly community psychologists, can respond to people arriving. In other words, respond to mass migration. There's also a problem of silence. Psychologists, particularly mainstream psychologists, are not taking migration all that seriously. But just as Cinzia said in her introduction, there is a clear threat. Far-right groups, organizations, and parties always use refugees as scapegoats. So whatever is wrong in a given place has to do with the new arrivals, the migrants, and the bad things that they're doing. So if psychologists remain silent, the right-wing propaganda works far more easily. In Greece, for instance, far-right groups continuously attack refugees and they continuously bombard people with racist propaganda. And if the government is not standing against them, their propaganda does work. So toward the end, one of the issues that psychologists have to face is the reasons for displacement. Current migration policies in Europe are turning Europe into what one might describe as a fortress. If the mass migration is continuing, the people arriving in Europe will be kept to the extent possible at the border, near the border, and to the extent possible, they will be processed there and sent back if they do not meet the definition or the criteria for being a refugee. But what happens when you look at the problem itself? If refugees are leaving because there are wars, if refugees are leaving because they can't sustain themselves, there is a problem. And the way to address this problem is not to address the refugees or the migrants arriving, but rather the problem itself. I always use this quote because this is the fundamental public health approach, preventing an issue, preventing a problem, preventing a real problem, which is primary prevention. The next obvious issue is militarism. Militarism leads to wars, and many may think that the wars are far away, but they're actually not far away. So let's take the example of the war in Afghanistan. People in Lesbos often ask, is there a war in Afghanistan? Why do we have so many Afghan refugees on this island? Well, the answer was obvious. Many people, actually generations of people in Afghanistan, lived with war and grew up in war. So all that they could do was basically leave Afghanistan because Afghanistan was in a state of permanent war. So if wars produce the so-called refugee crises, then wars should be stopped. Militarism is rather strong in places, particularly such as the United States. Therefore, if community psychology in Europe were to look to examples from the United States, there is not a very good example because militarism is a very strong influence. And if militarism prevails in the government, you have a second issue, which is threats to academic freedom. I happen to be an example of this. The regime in Turkey promotes militarism, and anyone who wants to stop militarism would actually be a threat to the regime and then will have to be kicked out of the universities, etc., etc. But if we want to end this and end it in a rather striking way, if psychologists do not address militarism and war, we are actually risking total annihilation, which has to do with nuclear annihilation, which is entirely possible. Places such as Italy and Turkey are full of nuclear weapons, but we also face gradual extinction due to climate change. Climate change is happening as we speak. And if we take climate change seriously, we can see the linkage between people not being able to find water, people not being able to find food, and having to leave their homeland. When they leave their homeland in large numbers, there you have mass displacement and mass migration. Therefore, the way to address the root causes of mass migration have to do with militarism, have to do with climate change, and so on. Therefore, psychologists have to address these problems and address them urgently. I should stop here. I think I took about 23 minutes. And any questions or comments, perhaps we can address now. Thank you.
Thank you, Serdar. I think that people will have to, let's say, digest your speech, your information, and your perspective. That, in a way, I think it gives clear ideas on what we are supposed to do. At the same time, I think it can also increase a sort of feeling of powerlessness, because it's very difficult in a way to address those challenges that you mentioned, that are global challenges, and that let's say are really the challenges that involve all the countries, all the people, even if I think that it's exactly as you said. I mean, if you're not dealing with the roots of those challenges, we will not be able to solve and to solve them, or at least to deal with them. I mean, and this is part really of the tradition of our discipline. But I would say my first question, just to open the, let's say, the discussion, is where should we start? I mean, the things that you have mentioned are many, and I think it's really also important. We are trying to do this as well, to involve students and engage them with these big issues. But let's say, which are your suggestions?
One quick suggestion.
A roadmap.
Sure. The roadmap might be difficult. However, it is important to look at this particular issue from a historical perspective. Very simple. When the Cold War ended, people expected something positive to happen. But when the Cold War ended, places such as Denmark became more militaristic. So if you look at Afghanistan, for instance, Afghanistan had troops from Denmark, and they started for the first time institutes of military psychology, because they didn't have them before. So what we are seeing is the end of Cold War, which was celebrated in many places, led to the opposite of what was expected: more military institutions, more NATO members, so on and so forth. So it is very important that we remember that addressing these issues require us as agents. In other words, we have to be cognizant of the fact that other people will not bring peace to us. The end of Cold War didn't bring peace. To the contrary, for instance, if you look at the United States, military spending increased and increased. So every year there is a record amount of money being spent on the military. I tend to study issues that are overlooked. So if you study what happened, for instance, in places like Vietnam, what you see is that psychology rarely dealt with the consequences of war in faraway lands. Vietnam is very far away from Napoli. It's very far away from Chicago. So what happens in Vietnam wasn't necessarily very important if you come from a mainstream perspective where you say, I work with what I have. I work with the people I see on the streets. I work with the citizens of this country, etc. So when you take a look at militarism, militarism might be happening away, causing wars away from you. But at this particular moment, what we are seeing is that wars happening far away from you are still your business, because mass migration is happening and people escaping this war will be knocking at your door sooner or later. So this perspective is particularly useful. But I would argue that psychology in general, psychology students in general, need a historic perspective so that they understand historically psychology hasn't been very good as far as human rights are concerned. Psychology in many places helped oppression and helped people who were harming the society. So one of the best examples is from South Africa. One of the architects, or one of the major architects of apartheid in South Africa, was a psychologist. So when you start introducing this, what we see is mainstream psychology in the United States grew with the help of the military. So if we know this is what happened in the United States, I would think that it is an important idea not to follow mainstream psychology very closely if it is in the United States. As you well know, mainstream psychology uses textbooks, uses theories and approaches from North America and also Britain. So when we are looking for a roadmap, that roadmap includes approaches that are indigenous to places such as Italy. This is why the community psychology history in Italy, in and of itself, is so very important. So many of the liberation psychology movements, if you look at them closely, they are domestic. They are not trying to follow models that are brought in from other places. And this I would have to attach to the movement that is called decolonizing movement. The decolonization of psychology, therefore, is part of the roadmap. And we can't expect EFPA, for instance, to suddenly say, we like decolonization. EFPA will never say that. The American Psychological Association, these big associations and big organizations will never be progressive. They are by definition conservative. This is why I think, to finish, I spoke too long, we need to rely more on our own organizations and our own strength, rather than relying on Brussels. To the extent possible, in my experience, I see very few solutions emerging from Brussels, be it the European Union, be it EFPA. They are different things. They are not necessarily places where we can obtain solutions from. Apologies for speaking too long.
Can I? Yeah.
Yes, please, Francesca.
Yeah, I want to thank you, Serdar, for really this important presentation. I really appreciated what you said, and I think it's really important that you started also from reflecting critically on language and on issues that are so normalized in the, in the public debate, in the policy debate, and also in the academic debate, because I have been really struggling a lot of time reviewing papers written by psychologists, for example, but not only, in which, for example, they use the expression refugee crisis, which is a terrible expression because it is diminishing. It's part of this vocabulary of violence and the humanization that has been created, that, I mean, you mentioned and you highlighted very well in your talk, to basically deprive people of their rights. Because if here there is a crisis, if it is a crisis of our Western societies, and the crisis of our values and the way the way we treat people in our countries. So I think the crisis here we have to look is a crisis of Europe, is a crisis of so-called northern countries, and not certainly a refugee crisis, because we are the ones who produce this crisis. They are not the crisis. So I think I really appreciated that. And I think it's really important and appreciate that you spoke about also this vocabulary, this approach that is very common in psychology, and I think we really need to challenge, which is about providing treatment or clinical services to the poor traumatized refugees, because basically this is all part of this humanitarian approach, which is basically the other hand of the securitization and the violence of borders. So on one side, the European Union is setting up an agenda which is completely about pushing people back, deporting people, depriving people of their rights. On the other hand, they kind of mobilize these humanitarian actors in order to treat these poor refugees that arrive traumatized on our shores. So I think we really need, as you mentioned, and I'm happy that you brought this topic today, a very deep reflection about how we have to challenge psychological institutions, how we have to create a new knowledge which is really, I mean, a knowledge that can be useful. How can we challenge all these approaches, which are basically just contributing to the reproduction of violence? Because I wonder, what a psychologist, for example, how ethical is the intervention of a psychologist in a refugee camp like Moria? I mean, that site is inhuman. We have to advocate for these sites to don't exist. We cannot, you know, advocate for providing, I don't know, psychotherapy to refugees in refugee camps in which they don't have the basic condition for a human life. So I think we really, and psychologists are doing this, and we need to find ways to challenge this. And I think it's really important also to find ways to bring in this debate the people, the protagonists who are facing this directly, so like migrants, the refugees, the people on the move, and to really put at the center their knowledge, their experiences, their insights in order to create approaches, theories, and new ways to deal with this phenomenon. So I don't know, I mean, this was more, was not really a question, but I was really, you know, I mean, you made me think to a lot of things. So I wanted to somehow give you back this feedback and my thoughts, and maybe if you want to expand on them or to add something. Thanks.
Grazie. I would like to mention something that relates to what you said, because most of the things that you said I already agree with. Because I'm living in exile and I have been in different countries, what I have seen is the pacification of psychologists. In Italy, the people, the psychologists I interacted with were very unhappy because instead of doing what they considered meaningful work, they were trying to get not so meaningful papers published. And I'm not exaggerating, they were very unhappy. And that made me super unhappy. But let's go to another place where things seem to be working in a much better way. Germany. Many people assume that things work very well in Germany. You go to different faculties, and what you see is that people don't speak much anymore. They are under a lot of pressure to publish. But because I'm an exiled scholar, you know, going from place to place, I walk in buildings and I sometimes find very interesting things. So I say, oh, did you see the incredible photos on the 3rd floor? So a professor might say, the 3rd. So the notion is that these academics have been pushed to a corner where they do projects that later lead to publications, and they don't have much time to even go to the 3rd floor, 1 floor up, because they're always busy. And I'm trying not to exaggerate. All I'm trying to say is that this sort of an approach where academics, including community psychologists, are pushed to publish and publish and publish, they are not going to look at the bigger picture that may or may not lead to publications in their field. To give you an example, you talked about border policies or the border regime or the border violence. If you work on border violence as a community psychologist, it is not very easy to publish that. And I'm aware of what I'm saying is common in other places. There is this type of conversation in other places as well. But to the extent possible, we need to find ways to break this vicious cycle. Otherwise, we will be turned into community psychologists who say they have a devotion to a field that is about change, that's about communities, that's about human values, but we are unable to do anything because we have to publish. So all we do is watch mass migration. All we do is watch something like Moria happen. So to be able to break away from this will allow us to address these issues. And it might be a small part, for instance, in the next European Community Psychology Conference. It might be a small part in some journal, or it might be a part in a new journal. But the idea is to respond to these real issues. And perhaps, I don't think Donata is with us. I mean, when you talk about climate change, people often think that nuclear weapons are not dangerous. But when you start talking about climate change, they understand a little more. I mean, climate change is with us and it's destroying the world. It's a better idea to respond to it now rather than later, which might be too late. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Serdar. And there is a comment from Cinzia in the chat, and she's saying, one colleague a few days ago told me that I should stop, and my doctoral students should also to focus on big challenges that cannot be solved by psychologists.
And I was not dealing with explicitly with the migrations or I don't know, climate change. It was really about civic engagement that in a way, of course, it's connected, but it's also to some extent a mainstream topic in psychology. I would not say in community psychology. It's a mainstream topic in psychology. But of course, this is really, in some cases, it's also difficult. So I really think that your suggestion to have, I don't know, small places of resistance, of intellectual resistance, I think it's very important. Also because, well, I think that those issues have to be dealt with, but also it's really the scenario that you were describing is a scenario where many of us, in some cases, in some point of their academic career, they feel lost because they feel that probably the meaning of the work they were supposed to do, of the activity that they were pursuing in the academic career, was different. And really this pressure on publishing, on making, on being productive, because this is something that is required in order to have funds, in order to have resources, and this is relevant for the younger generation, is really alienating also psychologists from the work they do. And they really, sometimes you really feel that you are losing the meaning of your work. So I think that this can be really an opportunity to have small, and of course they need to be probably small because they are competing with those other requests, but small places of resistance that can also bring food to our minds for developing new ideas, and also to, I don't know, also I think innovate to some extent our theories, our practices, because I think that the challenges that we are dealing with would really require also different different models of approaching things, different ideas, different theory. And I think that also your suggestion that we should be more, let's say, grounded on the local knowledge, on the bottom-up knowledge, is really something that is worth to be considered. And again, this was another comment, not probably a real question.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Any other questions or comments?
Probably the next question that we need to think about is how, where can we build this place of resistance? You were suggesting journals. Maybe we can think about a special, I don't know, I don't want to call it event, but a special place also in the European Conference. And eventually we could probably also start introducing this perspective in the conference that is going to take place in December. So the Slovakian Community Psychology Conference. I think that we can consider this as an opportunity to create an open space for discussion, for, I don't know, trying to be also make some show some capacity to reflect, to share, and eventually to, I don't know if we are able to deliver policies or issues, but at least some suggestion that could be considered also for future research and future activity.
I can respond in a couple of different ways. One of them is in a typical professional conference, you end up inviting people who are distinguished scholars in your field. That is fine. However, for new input and new perspectives, other people who are not necessarily scholars themselves can also be invited to speak. So that in and of itself offers a place where you do things a little differently. So someone, for instance, working with refugees who is not necessarily a community psychologist, but whatever this person is doing has a lot to offer to community psychologists. So that might be one way to think about it, inviting people who are not necessarily community psychologists themselves. So this would follow in involving people from other disciplines. It used to be that people were very excited when people from other disciplines were invited, because the idea was to find more intellectual nourishment and find new perspectives. So by going one step further or two steps further and inviting people who are not necessarily scholars themselves would be very useful. Secondly, highlighting work that doesn't stick to conventional approaches, I think is very useful. So what I mean by that is this. There are people, for instance, who are trained in a specific way or approach, and when they meet something that they have never heard about, that they never saw in their books, they say this is something that we don't deal with. But from my perspective is that if there is a serious issue in the place where I live in the community where I live in, I can speak to that. So instead of being a follower of my methods, I try to devise new methods to speak to the issues. So to give you one example, in 2004, I convinced a documentary maker to make a documentary about the lives of 6 young people taking the university entrance exam. This university exam every single year influenced about 4 to 6 million people, but nobody ever wrote about it, nobody ever studied it, because it was a norm, it was imposed, it was that. So it was like military service. So when you do something like this, a documentary, a very good one indeed, but it's not a method that you are taught, you are doing something innovative. So these types of innovative approaches can be highlighted, particularly in the conferences. And moving on to journals, I think there's a reason why we have more journals now in community psychology. And the search for new journals have to do with spaces of resistance at the same time. If you are being, let's put it this way, stonewalled in mainstream journals, if you have difficulty being listened to in other places, you create alternative journals. So the new journals, both in Europe and in the United States and elsewhere, are places where there is this resistance. And finally, as you well know, I like using Facebook. And the main reason why I use Facebook is because I think there is a lot of material that many of us can access very easily. They are often available on popular media such as YouTube, but they are not brought to the attention of community psychologists. So when we bring videos from different places, a video from Zambia, for instance. Zambia is a place that I don't expect to go anytime soon. But if there is great work happening in a faraway land and you are able to see it on YouTube or any other video provider, this is something that we can share. But as you probably well know, this is a complaint that I have been repeating over a long time. Many people are now pushed away from these Facebook pages that are very easy to use because they are seen as a waste of time. If we would like to create spaces of resistance, spaces where things are actually very interesting, discussion is very easy to do, one place to go is the ECPA Facebook page. This is how I approach it. And it doesn't really cost me much. It doesn't cost the observer much. And it's a place where we can very easily exchange things. And not everyone has to use it, but only perhaps one share per month would be a big contribution to the resistance, so to speak, or to the enrichment of the field. Thank you.
Thank you, Serdar. It's really, I think that your contribution to the ECPA mailing list, but also to the Facebook ECPA page is really appreciated because you really find things that are interesting and open new spaces of discussion. So,
do you have any other
comments
or questions?
No, I could just add to what you were saying, Serdar, that I would really be happy, and I think it would really be important to have, our next conferences that we mentioned, for example, the one that will be in Oslo. I mean, also people with migration background who can speak about border violence and about, you know, all what we mentioned today and much more. And I think we have really to learn from them, and probably all psychology students also have to learn from them. And yeah, so I hope that we will make this happen. Yeah, just this.
Agreed.
We can build a place where we can start listening really together to the real voice of people, of other experts, experiential experts that can really bring a different perspective also. And I think this is really, could be really powerful also for younger generation of community psychology that are facing with many challenges related to their perspective, their career. And I mean, I think it's also a strong message to give to them that we can really focus on those issues, that we are not forced to only think in mainstream ways, and that we can really, I mean, work on issues that are really related to the basic principles of the discipline that are social justice. That is not something that you can simply state as a principle and do nothing related to that. So I think that this conversation really brings us back to the core principle and the reasons for our discipline to be there, and I think that it's really stimulating to keep let's say this track open in terms of engagement, of focusing on issues that maybe are not so I don't know, appreciated in other areas, but really belong to our core I don't know, perspective, and it's something that we cannot ignore. So really, if I don't know if the other people from the board want to add something, just I give you the opportunity if you want.
I would like to thank to Professor Serdar for this inspiring talk. I represent Poland, and there are some students from Poland who participating in this event. So I think that for all of us it was very interesting, because it's the topic, I think, covered by politicians in Poland. I think it's a similar situation in other countries also. But I'm very sorry, because Poles have a lot of can say incidents, maybe not incidents, waves of migration historically, and we are around the world, and people were accepted in other countries in the very difficult times. And it's also sorry because it's people don't think about this wave of migrants, refugees in the south of Europe now. In the other categories that about other waves of migration. So changing the attitudes, I think it's the most important problem now in Poland, because refugees now are stigmatized as terrorists. So it's very difficult to discuss about it, because it's for me very awful and unaccepted. However, I think that your talk and your activity on Facebook, which I observe, is a small step to change this attitude. So thank you.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Let me offer you one anecdote which this discussion brought up. Among the refugees arriving in Europe, there are also people who are professionals themselves.
Mm.
And one of them, for instance, recently, I wrote about, because she was from Afghanistan and she was a midwife. And she believed in working with people, and she was extremely, extremely skilled in Afghanistan as well as in Greece, where she arrived. However, she was subjected to the regular asylum procedures and she was kept in Moria. And several months later, she died in a fire. And she was one of the many who died in Moria, but she was just a number, she was just a figure. Her skills were simply wasted, leaving aside the humanitarian component. So that brings me to another anecdote, which is also from Greece. A refugee psychologist went to one of the major institutes here to find out whether it might be possible to work in Greece as a psychologist. This person, the head of the institute, is well known, very, very well known, and all he could say was, you will not be able to work in this country in the mainstream. Perhaps you can work with refugees. So he didn't really know what a very bad statement this was. What he meant was the mainstream clinical psychology cluster in this country is going to serve who they always served, people who come to them with money. So if you are a refugee psychologist arriving in Greece, your chances of tapping those clients are low. Therefore, go work with the refugees. He had himself no intention to work with refugees because his job was to serve the affluent population. So I'm telling you this because this is in many ways what a typical clinical psychologist would do in many different countries. This is what practice is. You practice with who come to you, and who come to you would be a certain type of people. So in community psychology, we have the option of using a different lens. Cinzia just mentioned it. If you use a social justice lens, everybody deserves to be treated equally. Everybody deserves to meet with psychologists, etc., etc. So we have the option of using this lens. So we are not bound by a typical clinical psychology practice, business-minded practice. I think this is exactly why these types of conversations are important to have. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Do we have any other?
Thank you.
Looks like we don't.
No. So I'm going to close this webinar. I really want to thank you for your participation, for listening, for your comments, and for those who were not here. We are recording the event. So it would be important, I think, also in the light of the discussion that we had, probably to share the video and allow people who maybe were not able to join us to, let's say, have the opportunity to well, not really to engage in this discussion, but at least to be to get some provocative ideas and maybe use them to reflect, and maybe they would be willing to, let's say, stay strict to this idea that we were start to discussing today. So thank you again.
Thank you,
very much.
grazie. Grazie.
Bye.